We like to think of a design critique as a rigorous, objective process, a space where a team comes together, looks at a piece of creative work, and tests it against user needs and business goals. But if you've actually sat in one of these meetings, you know what usually happens. The objective evaluation breaks down, and the room devolves into a messy argument fueled by personal taste and loud opinions. Critiques fail when the focus shifts from the design problem to the social dynamics of the room. The conversation becomes a performance of status and momentum rather than an objective analysis of the work. This diagram illustrates a framework we can call the Taxonomy of office dynamics. It shows that when a design critique collapses, it almost always falls into one of three distinct behavioral traps: structural, cognitive, or social. A successful facilitator has to understand these specific traps. Identifying them is the only way to filter out the noise of human ego and actually isolate the pure signal of what the user needs. Let's start with the structural traps, the things that doom a meeting before it even gets going. Often, a designer will pull up a highly polished screen, point to it, and simply ask, "What do you think?" This creates what is known as the context vacuum. The team is suddenly asked to evaluate the work without any grounding in the user persona, the business objectives, or the technical limitations. The designer usually falls into this trap because of the curse of knowledge. They have stared at the problem for weeks, subconsciously assuming everyone else at the table already shares their deep understanding of the project's background. Another common structural error is timing. Teams often wait until the work is nearly finished to show it off. By that point, the design is fully polished and emotionally expensive to change, making real revision almost impossible. Because of these structural missteps, reviewers have nothing solid to anchor their thoughts to. They end up throwing out scattered, irrelevant feedback based on completely false assumptions. Without strict framing at the very beginning of the meeting to define the problem and constrain the scope, the group is mathematically guaranteed to spend the hour trying to solve the wrong puzzle. Once the discussion actually starts, we run into the second category of traps: cognitive failures. This diagram illustrates a classic cognitive trap known as bike shedding. Notice how we are looking at a simple structural layout, yet the focus isolates a single, insignificant detail. Reviewers will easily waste 20 minutes debating the exact color or corner radius of a button, while completely ignoring massive flaws in the overall architecture. The reason for this is entirely biological. Evaluating high-level user flow requires intense cognitive load. It is hard work. To avoid that effort, human brains lazily gravitate towards the simplest surface-level details they can grasp. This mental shortcut also leads to solutionizing, where reviewers prescribe exact fixes, like move that to a dropdown, instead of explaining why the current design fails. Or worse, you get the make it pop syndrome, where people offer vague, unhelpful feelings because they lack the technical vocabulary to articulate the actual friction they feel. A strong facilitator must push back here. If you don't force reviewers to translate those lazy, subjective preferences into objective, evidence-based risks for the user, the final design will simply cater to whoever argues the loudest. Beyond the structural and cognitive traps, we must examine the interpersonal power dynamics operating around the conference table. This introduces the HiPPO effect. HiPPO stands for the highest paid person's opinion. When a senior executive speaks first, their authority instantly suppresses any dissenting thoughts from the rest of the room, enforcing total groupthink. At this point, the meeting stops being a design review and becomes a status ritual. The conversation is no longer about surfacing actual risks in the product. It exists solely to demonstrate corporate hierarchy and enforce alignment. Faced with this kind of pressure, the designer often falls into presenter defensiveness. Their natural fight-or-flight ego response kicks in, and instead of taking notes, they start cross-examining the feedback and justifying every single pixel. To fix these social failures, you have to break the power dynamic. Explicitly separate the critique phase from final sign-off. Force senior leaders to speak last, or better yet, require everyone to leave silent feedback on digital sticky notes before anyone says a word. When a room is hijacked by power and status, the design team learns to optimize entirely for executive approval. And when that happens, the actual end user gets completely left behind. Now imagine that same conference room, but this time it is a calm, structured environment actively guided by a neutral facilitator holding the team to the rules. A critique serves as a data gathering exercise for the designer. This focus prevents design by committee, where a team tries to incorporate every conflicting suggestion into a disjointed, bloated interface that fails to serve a single clear goal. Even a perfectly run meeting can fall into our final trap, the black hole. If you don't assign a dedicated note-taker to document the insights and distribute actionable next steps, those brilliant realizations will evaporate the moment people leave the room. This is a diagnostic checklist you should save to identify and neutralize these traps in your next meeting. Look out for the context vacuum, solutionizing, bike shedding, subjective I likes, HiPPO effect, and the black hole. Facilitators who identify these cognitive and social traps can isolate the actual feedback the designer needs to unblock their work. By stripping away office politics, the critique becomes a practical tool that identifies gaps and suggests alternatives before the costly phase of development begins.